Hello, this is my channel, Weaving Weird Studio, and my name is Sig. Welcome to part 2 of my Learn to Crochet series. In this video, I will show you how to form a ring, crochet a slip stitch, and fasten off your yarn. I'll also help you understand the differences between UK and US stitches. If you find value in this video, you can help us grow by clicking on the like and subscribe button. Don't forget to tap on the notification bell to access my newest content. So without any further ado, let's get started. So in part 1 of the How to Crochet series, we learned how to do a slip knot and a chain stitch. Learned a little bit about the tools and the materials I'm going to use. So for those who watched part 1, you're going to notice that my hook is a little larger this time. And this is because I wanted a slightly larger hook in order to work with this stitch, because the slip stitch can be a particularly tight stitch. Now during this section, we are going to learn how to make a slip stitch, or at least the way I make a slip stitch, form a ring, fasten off, and then also I'm going to discuss with you the differences between USA and UK stitches. So today we're going to need scissors, going to need a yarn needle, going to need your hook. You can go with whatever hook you feel comfortable with, so long as it works with the yarn you are learning to practice with. I would strongly suggest a size G for most hooks. This particular brand that I'm using today, a G, we discovered in the last session, is just slightly bigger than a standardized G or the standard 4mm size G. So I was using an F in that first video. But this time, as I said before, I want a looser stitch. So I'm going to go one size up and use this hook in order to achieve that. And so now that you've had time to practice the part 1 series, you can now move into learning how to do the slip stitch. Even though slip stitches can be used to create beautiful patterns and fabrics on their own, they are commonly used when you want to avoid adding height to your row or when you want to make a ring. So we're going to begin by first showing you how to make a ring. That is the simplest thing in the world, and it will also be a great way to get you started on a slip stitch. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do the slip knot. And then I'm going to make a chain. I'm going to do a chain of 5. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to put that hook into the very first chain that I made. I'm going to take my yarn and pull it over the hook, and then I'm going to use my hook and pull the yarn through that chain stitch, and then I'm going to pull it through the loop that is on the hook. And with that, I have my ring, and I am ready to begin any work that I might start with a chain. And this is your basic loop. And in a future lesson, I'll discuss how to make an adjustable ring, or it's also known as a magic ring, but we'll get to that in a few more videos. But for now, this is how you might make a ring. Okay. So now on to the slip stitch. So now there again, slip knot. Remember, never count your slip knot as a stitch. Try to avoid doing that. And then you can make this chain any length that you would like to make it. I think I'm going to make it around 10 chains for this lesson. Okay, so I have 10 chains on there. And now because I want each row to follow to be 10 chains also, I am going to do a +1 chain. So even though my row is going to be 10 chains long, I need to compensate for the turn, and so I'm going to add 1 additional chain in order to do that, so I can maintain 10 stitches in each row. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is now when I get ready to do the slip stitch and the actual chain stitch, I'm going to take the hook, I'm going to put it into the back loop of the chain stitch, and then I'm going to take my yarn and pull over and then pull that yarn through the chain and then pull it again through the loop. Again, hook through the back, or through the back loop of the chain, yarn over my hook, pull the yarn through, and then pull the yarn through the loop on the hook. So now, because as I mentioned before, this is really a tight stitch if you're not careful, a little trick to also help keep this stitch, manageable and easy to work with is to do one extra little step while you're doing this. Okay, so it's basically the same motion. Put your hook through the back of the chain, or the back loop of the chain stitch, yarn over, pull your yarn through, and then instead of pulling your yarn through the loop on your hook just yet, just give it a slight tug, right? And this will help keep your stitches more manageable, and then you pull it through. So again, pull that, give it a little tug, and then continue to pull that yarn on through. Otherwise, if you don't do that, you risk making your slip stitch so tight that when you come back again for your next, for going through your next row, it's really hard to get the hook through. So let me go ahead and do this until the end of the row. And pull through. Okay. Again, now remember, your yarn doesn't have to be fancy. The yarn I'm using today certainly isn't. This is just for practice after all. Okay, so now as you can see, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? Now we're going to turn. So to turn your work is real simple. It's just like it sounds. You're going to turn your work. So this would be the side facing you. You are going to turn the work so that you begin working back from your right side to your left side. And again, you're going to want to kind of keep it loose. Look for your stitches on top. So that's the only thing, is it gets a little tricky to find your stitches with the slip stitch because they're so tight. So this is going to be your slip stitches. You can kind of see your little V shapes. And then you're going to have your front loops and then your back loop. Unless the pattern specifically tells you that you need to only work in the front loop, or specifically tells you that you need to only work. Anyway, let's see if I can. Or if your pattern specifically tells you that you need to only work in the back loop, you will actually, just as you might suspect, work in both loops. Okay, and there's plenty of patterns because that's how you're going to make your designs, is the altering between back loops and front loops, and using both loops together. Okay, so I've got my hook in through my stitch, and I'm going again, yarn over. I'm going to pull it through. I'm still going to give it kind of a little tug because this is a slip stitch and I don't want it to get too tight. And then I'm going to pull it through that loop on the hook. And again, in through the two, or through the whole stitch, which is going to give you the front loop and the back loop. And I'm going to yarn over and pull that yarn through, give it a little tug, and again. So we're going to continue to do this to the end of this row. And so this will make 2 rows. So you'll have a foundation row, which will basically consist of your chain stitches. And then your first row will be your first row of slip stitches. And then, of course, your second row is the second row of slip stitches, and so on and so forth. Okay, so now let's see how many stitches I have on this row so far. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And my 10th stitch is kind of here and it looks kind of off to the side. So that's okay. Just make sure that you actually put your hook through the stitch itself and not another part of that edge. Okay, so. And so that gives us our 10 stitches on our row. So the next thing we're going to do is fasten off. And when we fasten off, I'm going to actually also show you how to weave that end in a little bit. So fastening off is pretty simple. You're going to cut your yarn. And then what I'm going to do is kind of like a slip stitch again. I'm going to yarn over. Then I'm going to pull my yarn through that loop. And I'm going to just give it a slight little tug. And that is how I fasten it off. Now we're going to show you how to weave this in. So weaving in is just a way to hide your ends. And so what you're going to do is you're going to turn your piece to the back side of the piece. So it's a little hard to show on this because, well, it's only 2 rows. And you can see how tight this stitch is. But this is going to be the front part of your work, and this is the back part of your work. If you know anything about knitting, the back part looks more like what a purl stitch would look like if you were a knitter. So you see the little, it's kind of, it has these little seed looking bumpy things on the back. That's typically the back of your work. And what I want to do is I want to take my end, and when I weave it in, I kind of want to go with the flow of the stitch, right? I don't want to tug too tight. I just want to hide it in through the back of the piece. I just want to kind of bring it in. And then as you might with embroidery, at least this is how I do it, I will bring my stitch, kind of weave it back in the direction from where I came. And I feel like this gives me a better hold. So like if the piece gets washed, it does not, the end doesn't accidentally get pulled out. This kind of locks it into place. So now we're going to cut it. And there you go. Voila. Okay, perfect. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about the differences between US and UK stitches. If you give me just a minute, I will pull my tablet down here and see if this is going to show up on the screen for you. Okay, there you go. Okay, so this is basically the conversion chart. So we have US names on your left-hand side and UK names for the same stitches on your right-hand side. As you can see, the chain stitch on both sides is still called a chain stitch, and the abbreviation is similar. And then also with the slip stitch, right? The slip stitch for the American or for US terminology is slip stitch and slip stitch. So now when we move on down further, the next thing that gets a little tricky, right? So this is why you want to be aware of the pattern that you're reading. You could be reading US pattern, or you could be reading a UK pattern. And so that's going to mean that you're going to have to approach your stitches slightly different. I mean, well, your stitches are going to be the same. It's just the name of the stitches change a little bit. So for example, in a US pattern, it's going to tell you to do a single crochet. Well, here in the US, what we would call a single crochet, in the UK, they call a double crochet. And so that can totally change the look of your work, and it can totally like make you feel like you're a complete failure if you get a pattern that's, let's say, a UK pattern, and you approach it with American understanding of the terminology and definitions. And that's really frustrating, because a lot of new crocheters don't know the difference. And because they don't know the difference, they get very discouraged because their piece just does not end up looking the way they expected it to. And they really honestly don't understand why. And why would they if they don't know that there's a difference between the US and the UK concepts of the stitches. So your single crochet, what we would call a single crochet in the US, is actually called a double crochet in the UK. And then from there, we just mostly start stepping it up. So in the US, what we call a half double crochet is called a half treble crochet in the UK. And then you can see, and I put the abbreviations next to it for you. Also in the US, a double crochet is called a treble crochet in the UK. A treble crochet in the US is called a double treble crochet in the UK. A double treble crochet in the US is called a triple treble crochet in the UK. Yarn over is the same thing. We call it a yarn over. They call it a yarn over. However, the abbreviation's slightly different. As you can see, in the US, it's going to be a YO, and then in the UK, it's going to be a Y0H. Gauge and tension, basically the same thing, but here in the US, we call it a gauge, and in the UK, they refer to it as tension. Skip, to skip a stitch, we simply say skip, and in the UK, they will say miss or skip. Now, I see a lot of times in the older patterns, like the more vintage patterns, you see the word miss used a lot of times. I know when I first started, and I first started looking at the vintage patterns, and I didn't realize that, particularly at that time, there wasn't a real comprehensive cohesion between how people did their patterns, right? So patterns and understanding of how they were followed and how they were even written was so new and so different from one region to another. You almost have to experiment, particularly with the old turn of the 20th century vintage patterns. You have to first it helps to kind of know what it is you're looking for, and kind of what, when you look at the image of the piece they're showing you, kind of, once you've been doing this a while, you kind of figure out kind of which stitch you're probably looking at. But boy, when I was first new at it, I'd get so frustrated, and I really thought there was something wrong with me, and I hadn't realized that the understanding or the way the pattern was written was so different from one pattern writer to another. There wasn't this comprehensive attempt to standardize the patterns, to standardize the abbreviations and the concepts until a little later. So that makes it really tricky. So if you're a beginner, you probably want to stay away from those patterns if you value your maintaining a moderate frustration level. And then, of course, Fasten Off. Fasten Off in the US is pretty much the same as Fasten Off in the UK. All right. I think that about does it for us for this lesson. I thank you again for joining us. If you have any questions, any comments, any suggestions, please leave them in the comments section of my page. And go and have a wonderfully creative day. Thank you.